Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. If you've never been here before, you're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube channel, which is a group of writers from Vancouver who just enjoy narrative. And what we do on Tuesday nights is we look at old folk tales and fairy tales and basically just enjoy them. I know, how weird. I just realized I gotta adjust my screen a little bit. But if you've never been here before, and you do enjoy it tonight, consider liking and subscribing. I mean, I'll have to earn that to such a thing. But I hope you will. What we're discussing tonight is a thing called kobolds. Now, if you've never heard of kobolds, that's fine. They aren't really that common unless you are a part of certain circles. And by certain circles, I mean people who play tabletop RPGs, like myself. They were used by Gary Gygax in the original D&D, and they've been in D&D pretty much ever since. However, as with most things in D&D, he got them from old folklore. In fact, D&D is in many ways an extension of what folklore was, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Just very quickly, I want to go over a little bit about kobolds and how they're presented in D&D. And then I'm going to go straight into folktales. If you are not watching this live and you don't want to hear anything about kobolds, you just want to hear the tales, there will be timestamps down below. You can jump into anywhere that interests you and listen to a story. So, for those not in the know, kobolds are, in D&D, they're small, subterranean kind of cousins to dragons. Physically, they are short, scaly, with lizard snouts, and they have personalities that are greedy, they're imperialistic, and they are thieves with universally ill intent. And that is because D&D traditionally, going back to like the 80s, associated character traits such as their alignment of being evil to race. For hopefully obvious reasons, that is something they don't do much anymore. Although it is still around. Kobolds in European folklore, though, aren't really... They share some of that, but they're not really like that. Particularly German folklore, which is one of the main places you see them. They are a lot more diverse. And we're going to see that through the folklore that we discuss here. Or read, rather. Primarily, we're just reading stories here. This isn't really a class. But the kobolds are usually tenacious, but they don't always have ill intent. And we'll end with a couple of stories that show that you can get along with kobolds just fine. They actually, rather than having a lot in common with D&D's kobolds, kobolds actually have quite a bit in common with the highly problematic and extremely disturbing house elves from Harry Potter. And if you're like, well, what's problematic about house elves? I would encourage you to read the books. That's the only time I'm going to be doing that. Because, my God, I won't get into it here, but it's not good. But kobolds are obviously an influence on the idea of a house elf, because in many ways they function like a house elf. What they really are, though, is they're an iteration of sort of Gaelic and Celtic cultures collectively call this the good people. They're little people that go around and do things. They're not good, by the way, in almost any of those cultures. It's almost like you call them that so that they don't come after you. And that includes everything. They have similarities to things like Cornish piskies all the way over to like Irish leprechauns. Although they are very much distinct from those things. They are kind of that same category. And so the stories we're going to look at are a cross-section of specifically German folk tellings of kobolds. Most of them that I'm going to read here tonight were previously untranslated to English. I am able to read them tonight because of Jürgen Hubert, who is a modern-day translator. You can talk to him. He shows up in the comments. He might show up in the comments of this video. He is translating a bunch of stores of old collected oral folktales and written folktales from German archives and books and so on, and putting them into English for the first time, or at least the first time in a long time in some cases. So all of these stories that we're going to read tonight come from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, which if you're not watching live, there is a pinned comment below where you can link to his Patreon and help support his efforts of translating all of this so that I can read them. And I think you should. I do. My goal here is not so much to educate, because I am not a folklorist by training. What I am is a writer and a storyteller. And my goal is to tell you a good tale, something funny, something entertaining, something in some way engaging. And what isn't engaging is a long talk from me, so I'm going to carry on. I have picked the stories tonight based on giving you a broad sense of understanding of kobolds as they would have been understood by someone in the German countryside. Yeah, I think that's a good enough place to start. So, we are going to start with probably the most exciting tales about these creatures, and that is what happens when you release them accidentally. And anybody who knows pretty much anything about folk tales, again, folk tales are not fairy tales. These are not necessarily for kids. Nothing too shocking tonight, but just know folk tales are tales told to other adults usually, and are held up as being a true story, whereas a fairy tale is not always the case. But we're going to look at what happens when you release a kobold. And there's 3 stories we're going to look at about that, and I will introduce them as they come up. Pardon me, a little bit of congestion there. Okay, let's turn the music down just a little bit. We do like to have a little bit of ambiance, and our first story takes place in a farm setting, so maybe a little wind. Right. Okay, and of course, when you're on that parallel, there's always a little bit of rain. So our first tale is a oral tale from Gutenberg that was translated by Jürgen Hubert in his collection of Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, which you can find in the pinned comment below if you're not watching live. And it is called The Farmer and the Kobold. A farmer had forced a kobold into his service and made him fetch food, money, and whatever else he needed on a daily basis. Whenever the kobold stepped into the door with a load, the farmer told him every time, "Unload and fetch more." And even when sweat was running across the kobold's face from the exertion, he still had to immediately go out and continue his errands. But one day, the kobold brought a big bag full of ducats, which are coins, which caused the farmer to joyfully exclaim, "Unload the rest! This is enough for today and tomorrow, and then it shall be enough for eternity," said the kobold and laughed. "Now may
God have mercy on you for telling me to rest, for now I will stay here until a priest who is free of sin banishes me from this place. We shall share this chamber. You will stay where you are, and I will sit here, and the beam running across the ceiling will separate our realm, and if you come over to my side or attempt to get out the door, I'll twist your neck,"
said the kobold. Well, at these words, the farmer became very frightened and called for help, which caused his neighbors to gather. But as they saw the kobold with his long green cloak and his glittering eyes sitting in the main chamber, they were afraid and stayed outside. And the farmer told them of his misfortune and asked them to send for a priest who was able to banish the kobold. But the kobold laughed and said,
"Send as many as you want, but they will not be able to move me. Right now there are only 2 priests in the world who'd be able to banish me, and they live far from here, one of them in the direction of the morning and one in the evening."
And for several years, many hundreds of priests arrived, but none of them were able to banish the kobold. And as soon as one of them stepped onto the threshold and wanted to start his exorcism, the kobold, laughing, recited his sins, and the priest reddened, having to leave. The sins of the priest, to be clear. However, one time the farmer was close to his salvation. A priest arrived, and the kobold told him,
"You nearly would have had power over me. You only have committed 1 sin in your life. But when you were a boy, you stole 2 eggs from your mother's hen, and for this reason, you cannot banish me either."
And thus the farmer still sits in the chamber with the kobold. For even though he does not eat or drink anything, he cannot die, but must sit until one of the 2 priests arrive who have power over that spirit. If you are coming here from D&D, which I play an enormous amount of, or Pathfinder, who also has their own version of kobolds, I think that'd be a cool NPC, personally. A guy who was trapped in a house and was like, "I cannot die. I've been trapped here for 2 centuries. Because of this kobold." It's a new version of a fetch quest. All right. Our next tale is the Kobold from Stedten. Just get a drink of water before I start. Okay, carrying on with our what happens when you release a kobold, whether accidentally or on purpose. This next one is very short, but it gives you an idea of some of the menace they can cause. We're outside this time, so let's go outside. This story is called The Kobold in Stedten, and it also comes from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, a collection of translations by Jürgen Hubert, who you can support in the pinned comment below if we are not watching live. Well, a new house was built in Stedten near Schlaplau. An iron chest was found during the excavations for the foundation. And when it was pulled up, chipped open, swung atop. A small red man jumped out of it, who joyfully danced in a circle and constantly shouted, "Now I am released! Now I am released!" And he told that he was a kobold. And he had been bound into this chest many centuries ago. But now, being released, declared his intention to live in that new house they were building once it was finished. And well, the man didn't take it that seriously. Thought it might have even been in his head. He finished the house, and when its construction was completed, well, that little red man came all night. It released the animals in the stables. And drove them across the yard and jumped the stairs up and down and made such a racket that nobody wanted to live in the house anymore. Like I said, a short one. Now the next, our final story on releasing them, before we go on to what happens if you capture or enslave them, is a story about a wedding. This third story of the night is called The Kobold at the Wedding, and it is a story also from Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, translations of German folklore by Jürgen Hubert. If you want to summon a kobold, you only need to pull the inside of your cap out when you see one traveling through the air. Then, should you do that, it has to come down and do whatever you demand. Well, a farmer from Gutenberg knew this, and summoned a kobold to him in this manner, who he found to be flying heavily loaded with flour, rice, coffee, sugar, and similar items far above him. When the kobold stood in front of him, he asked the farmer politely to release him. "I have served the girl for many years," he said, "and tomorrow she has her wedding. She promised me that if I brought everything I needed for the wedding feast, I would be able to dance with her in the evening, and I would like that very much. And if you release me, you shall be invited to the feast and the dancing. You only need to arrive in the evening and look through the window." The farmer liked this proposal, so he straightened his cap, putting the inside back in. And soon the kobold flew away with its many sacks of coffee and so on. On the next morning, that man started walking to the village where the wedding was to take place, and as evening turned, he arrived and he stood at the window of the room where the bridal party with their many guests had gathered. And he saw, when And looking through that window, the kobold wearing a long, wide green garment, dancing with the bride, and every time when they waltzed past the window, he knocked against the glass. And when the first dance was over, he saw the kobold speaking covertly with the father of the bride. And immediately the latter led the farmer into the room with great honors. And they gave him a good seat at the table. And thus the farmer received a joyful feast and danced until the morning. I normally don't add Jürgen's notes, translator notes in, because those are very much his own property and so on. But I do want to add the way that Jürgen chooses to frame this is absolutely hysterical to me. He says, I find the concept of using cap as a folkloric pokeball fascinating. But he also points out something that is interesting, because GS has added something here. Stop our background noise. GS has added something here, which is, boy, these creatures are wicked. And here's the thing. I don't know that they are. If you pause and you ask yourself really what is being asked of these things, they're kind of being enslaved. And these next two stories, I think, go a little further to showing that they are usually get into your house because, with the exception of that one, they usually get into your house because you kind of enslave them, whether on purpose or by accident. And so I can understand why they might be in a bad mood about stuff, slavery, to put it, understate it quite a bit. Not a thing that puts a person in good spirits. So moving on to two stories about what happens if you capture or enslave them. We're going to start with Kobolds for Sale, which is a short anecdote, I would say. And then we're going to follow it up with The Devil as a Colorful Ribbon, which is framed as either the devil or a kobold, but it's probably a kobold. And that's a more accidental capturing and enslaving of them. Okay. So this is Kobolds for Sale, a story again from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, a collection translated by Jürgen Hubert. In the Arabas Hof in Leipzig, it is possible to purchase kobolds, but one must be aware of being cheated. For there are poor and rich kobolds. The rich ones bring their master money and food and whatever else he demands of them. But the poor ones do not own anything themselves, and thus cannot give anything. Therefore they only live off the possessions of their master, and thus are a great burden, especially since it is not possible to get rid of them once you have them. Oh yes, imagine being a great burden by just taking someone else's possessions for no particular reason. It's amazing to me the duality of thought required for this story, right? Because the first half is a description of exactly what it's warning about in the second half, except you're the one leeching off the kobold. And I think it's kind of the first indication we get of that kind of house elf dynamic, which is, this seems to imply that some kobolds can have their own kind of wealth to their name, and you're just forcing them to give it to you. Which sort of aligns with our earlier stories. Now, on that idea, this isn't the only way to come into possession of a kobold. We've seen how they can come into your house by accident, but we also are going to see one of sort of accidentally capturing, nonetheless, though. Accidental kidnapping. And I think as we read this, because the story frames it one way, I want you to ask yourself, though, imagine if this was an accidental imprisonment, and it was indeed the case that you just can't be released otherwise. How would you react? A farmer went back to Nye Mulinkamp from Sodo. Then he saw a beautiful, many-hued, silken rainbow lying on the road. Now, it was very beautiful, so he picked it up, but without saying, "Help God, Lord Jesus Christ," as it is proper under such circumstances. He wanted to bring it to his wife as a gift. She was indeed very happy about it, and she put it in her trunk. Now, the house was strange from this day onwards. Nothing was in its proper order in their household. In the morning, while getting up, one piece of clothing was missing, and soon the next, and they were impossible to find despite thorough searches of the house. The same occurred with implements of cutlery, and for cutting straw, and plowing, and so forth. It did not take long until this haunting escalated to a larger scale. In the chambers, chairs and tables were thrown over. To sum it up, there was such an infernal ruckus that no one could bear to stay there. An old wise woman was asked for help in this matter, and she immediately asked,
"Had perhaps he found something and took it home without a blessing?"
Well, instantly the man remembered that colorful ribbon. He told of it and got the advice from the woman to pay close attention to this very thing. And so when the farmer came home and the mischief was active in full force, hurriedly he opened the trunk into which the ribbon had been placed, but it could not be found there. And so it was only after the noise had died down could the silken ribbon be found at its usual spot in the trunk. Now it was clear that the ribbon was the kobold, or perhaps even the devil himself. The man thus blessed himself with the words, "Help God, Lord Jesus Christ," and took it into his hand and carried it to the same spot where he'd taken it from in the first place. And since that time, as I imagine you can guess, he did not notice any trace of a haunt in his old farmer's house. And hey, that's what I would expect if you freed something you accidentally locked up in your home. It is interesting to me, this idea that you're supposed to say something when you pick stuff up off the ground. I'd be curious what the full story is on the history of that, because I've certainly never heard of it, but it obviously was fairly obvious to whoever it was that originally created this story. Now, at this point, you're saying, sure, you can capture and enslave them. And you might be getting kind of ill-gotten goods from these kobolds. But we know that releasing them it created terrible circumstances. So, what are we to do? And I propose to you that it's a chicken and egg scenario, because I'm going to tell you 3 very short stories to finish this off. We probably will finish a bit early today. These 3 short stories I think you'll notice a trend, which is kobolds are kind of reasonable if you don't enslave them. I don't know if this is the intentional story that the many countrysides that have come up with the kobold as a concept really wanted to get across, but it is very much the message. And I think you'll see in a moment that kobolds are indeed, just like us, fairly ornery when we're enslaved, and kind of just decent if we're appreciated and at least somewhat paid. So, our next story is The Kobold in Klostermansfeld. And it comes from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles translations by Jürgen Hubert. It's very short. The next two are as well. A woman in Klostermansfeld has a kobold who visits her every Sunday, and when bells are rung for mass, she sets the table and puts down 2 plates, sits down at it. And when that sermon begins, a kobold flies through the through the chimney and brings with it food and drink. And then they sit down together, have an enjoyable meal until the sermon is over. And then the kobold flies away again through the chimney, looking like bright, burning fire. I would say that I think the intention of the story originally is the devil's keeping her from church. However, I think it shows us that kobolds can be quite reasonable. Our next story is The Kobold and Büschdorf. This story also comes from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, translations by Jürgen Hubert, and it is called The Kobold in Büschdorf. There was an old, very rich woman in Büschdorf who had a kobold. That kobold sat on her kitchen stove all day, and she conversed with him. Sometimes the neighbors would stand beneath her windows and listen and hear the kobold say,
"Say, old woman, don't you wish for anything?" "Well, sonny," she would reply, "I wish for a nice golden chain, or I wish for a bag full of ducats."
Or whatever else she wished for on that particular day. And then the kobold would immediately fly out of the chimney and return with whatever she had desired. And our last story, again a short one, is The Kobold in Jena. And I think this one does the most to maybe explain their disposition. There's a phrase in here that I apologize to all German speakers. There is something about it that I really struggled to pronounce, and we're all going to learn that together. But the phrase means the Yellow Angel. This is The Kobold in Jena. It's also a story from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, translations by Jürgen Hubert. There used to live in the pub Zum Gelben Engel, in front of the Laboratoire in Jena. Some beer, meat, and other food was set aside for him each day, and a red suit every year. And in exchange, the kobold kept the stables clean and brought good food to the innkeepers. But when something was amiss in their appreciation of him, well, he became very unruly and wild. And I think that final point makes the point. See, if we go back through our stories about kobolds, the farmer, the first story we read, effectively overworks the kobold. And the first opportunity the kobold gets to get its revenge, it gets it very thoroughly. In the kobold in Stedten, where he is pulled out of the box, we don't know the backstory, but he's been locked in a box by people for God knows how long. And as we know, they're not necessarily nefarious creatures. And so I can understand why he would only have menace in his heart. Now, the kobold at the wedding, when let go, follows through on its promise. Allows this man to come to a wedding, which, by the way, common decency would say just let that thing go. Jurgen makes that point. But, you know, it made a deal and it followed through on it. And it just wanted to dance with the girl. In Kobolds for Sale, I think we cut to the heart of the matter, which is people are using these kobolds for their resources without really earning it, which is a really elaborate way of describing slavery. And yet, they don't see themselves as... they resent the idea that they would have a kobold dependent on them, but they don't really see themselves as being the same the other way. With the colorful ribbon, yeah, we see a tenacious spirit, but like it's like a kid that you kept trapped in your house. And then finally, in the last those three stories, we see what happens if you aren't particularly rough on kobolds, if you kind of just let them do what they do and speak with them and give them food and stuff. They're helpful spirits. And isn't that interesting? If you meet them on their terms, are generally kind, give them resources, they help around the house of their own volition. They seem to only get angry when they're forced to do so. So in terms of the lore, I think that is, I think that's an interesting contrast. I don't think that's the intention of these stories, but that is what I take from them. It's a message about how you treat the people that you work with. With that said, if you came here because of Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder, you'll notice there is absolutely no indication that they are lizards. There's absolutely no indication that they are subterranean, which is a common thing for kobolds. Like if you do the Pathfinder 2nd edition beginner box, there's, spoiler alert if you're a player about to play that, but there is a town in that has a bunch of kobold tunnels from an ancient kobold colony. There is the fact that kobolds are always in groups. In D&D, they travel in tribes and they have hierarchies and stuff, but they seem to be kind of loners in lore. But what they do have in common is a tenacious spirit. And I guess you could look at the kobolds being thieves as the other side of these stories, because where did he get that bag of ducats? GS says he fell for the kobold's nice guy act. I would... Oh. I'm guessing, is that the kobold at the wedding one that comment was in regard to? GS also says we'll have to send you a pet kobold. Yeah, please. I'd love to have archaic little creatures. But yeah, they're solitary little creatures, which is kind of like how leprechauns are. Piskies aren't that way in Cornish. One of my least watched videos, unfortunately, even though they are fascinating little creatures, was a video, oh Christ, like a year and a half ago. So be prepped for a little lower quality. Same mic, different camera. But I did a thing on Cornish Piskies, which are really interesting. They're sort of They're sort of a version of fairies, I guess, is what I would call them. All right. Well, if you made it this far, maybe you liked it. And if you liked it, consider subscribing. We're at 90 subscribers, which is not a lot in terms of YouTube, I know. But in terms of a person doing writing-related content and long-form storytelling, in the day and age of the internet, it is quite a landmark for me. I'm very proud of that. Getting dangerously close to 100 subscribers, still no idea what I would do to say thank you for that, because I don't really know what you guys want. I wish I did. It seems like I can never predict what stories and streams are going to catch your attention the most, but I'm always happy when they do. And one way that I can know that is if you like the stream. It's a little click. If you liked it, it's super helpful. I've come to realize more than I would like to admit. It's super helpful for getting the video in front of people who might like its eyes, which is very helpful to me, and I really appreciate that. Beyond that, if you really enjoyed it and you're like, how can I get that guy something, which I'm sure is not the case, but in case you did, I do have a little coffee link. It's spelled like Ko-Fi, down in the description below, where you can buy me a coffee if you enjoyed the stream. But you don't have to do that. It's just there as an option. I know we had some hosting fees and stuff come up this month, so this would be a good month for it if you were considering it. But it's not required. And beyond that, I have greatly enjoyed reading about kobolds. If you liked hearing stories about these creatures from D&D or lore, I'm thinking of doing maybe something on dwarves next week. Let me know, and I'll try to do more of it. I don't have an endless supply. There isn't as much lore backing all of that stuff as you might think, but yeah, I don't think I need to say more than that, do you? I'll keep the fire warm for you. I've been Rory. Thank you very much for listening to my stories on kobolds. And if you're playing some D&D, have fun and maybe work in some details from the origin stories of real kobolds. Have a good sleep.